Security is always a top concern for IT professionals. In security, we often struggle to define what variables truly matter and which ones we are free to change. Does it really increase risk if we let the marketing department use Dropbox? What would happen if desktop antivirus went away? There is more flexibility in any system than there at first appears, and some technology and architectural choices can reduce or increase our degrees of freedom. Hi, I'm Stan Gibson, Senior Managing Editor for IDG Communications Strategic Marketing Services, and welcome to this live, interactive webcast. Joining me is Dr. Hugh Thompson, Chief Security Strategist at Blue Coat Systems, who will tell us what we can learn from mathematics and other fields, and how we can identify and leverage degrees of freedom in the age of advanced threats. Welcome, Hugh.
Hi, Stan. Thank you, and welcome, everyone. It's been a very interesting few years in information security. A lot's changed in this space. And what's interesting about it is that we are a very young discipline. We're learning a lot. And we're going through a transition that I think many disciplines have gone through in the past, and that's being able to measure and sort out what really matters. There's a concept for this in the field of statistics called degrees of freedom. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit during this presentation because I think that the maturity of an industry can be measured by how well we understand the things that matter and the things that don't, the things that are free to vary. So I'll spend some time talking about that and spend some time talking about what we can learn from other industries that have gone through the same maturity and same transition. But before we get started, I wanted to share a personal security story that really brought this into focus for me. And this happened quite a while ago. So this was back in 2000. I was in the middle of my PhD program, and I did a summer internship at a very large, unnamed software company in Washington State. And so I was there. I was probably working 100 hours a week as an intern, writing a lot of code, doing a lot of testing. And it was a very important time in the history of IT, I think, because Windows 2000 Server had just been released. And we were working on an enterprise product that sat on top of Windows 2000. So we were doing a lot of testing in the final days before we released this thing to manufacturing. And so this incident happened on a Saturday. I was at the office, a bunch of us were, and we were in the testing lab. And to just give you a visual of this lab, it had rows and rows of machines, and there were mice and keyboards on the floor and just scattered all over the place. The place looked chaotic, but for us it was pretty organized. And my boss was there, and he brought his 2-year-old son with him. So we're sitting there in the lab, and he asks me, how are things going? And I said, well, things are going really well. We haven't had any major crashes in the last few days. I think we're in really good shape. We've been really pounding on this product. And then suddenly he realizes his 2-year-old son is missing. Right? So we start looking for this 2-year-old in the lab, which again had keyboards on the floor, mice everywhere. It's actually pretty dangerous now that I think about it. And we found him through one of the aisles, and he was sitting in front of a keyboard, and there was a screen that was in front of him, so a keyboard attached to a machine, and it had the blue screen of death. And for me, this was a pretty incredible moment. We'd been trying to get the blue screen of death for a long time because we were testing this product. And I could just imagine the fallout from this from my boss, right? Hey, a 2-year-old could have found this bug. I can't believe you hadn't found it already. So we then spent the next couple of hours trying to figure out what did this 2-year-old do to find a bug that we hadn't been able to find. And so there's a lot of superstition in the field of software testing. Anyone who's been in that discipline before, you know that there is I'd say it's an industry that itself has gone through a lot of maturity. But back then, there weren't a lot of very specific disciplines around it. So we tried to reconstruct what this 2-year-old could have possibly done. And we first, sat in front of the machine, tried to ourselves simulate being a 2-year-old, which, looking back on it, was fairly embarrassing. We then tried to reconstruct the event, so we put an actual physical cookie on top of the keyboard, hoping that the 2-year-old would be attracted to it and do whatever he did before, and we sort of silently watched from around the corner of that particular row. Didn't work, didn't get anything done. The 2-year-old had a wet diaper at the time, so we thought that moisture could have played a factor, so we played around with that, and nothing transpired that could reproduce this bug. And it turned out, after quite a while of trying to reconstruct what had happened, that the 2-year-old had walked into that aisle and sat down on the shift key of the keyboard. And many of you, I'm sure, remember the sticky keys feature that was added in Windows 2000. The way that it worked is if you press the shift key a bunch of times, a box would come up and say, hey, look, it seems like you really enjoy the shift key or you want to keep it pressed. Would you like for us to continue to press it for you? And almost always you'd select no on that box, but it turned out that it was using a mechanism of communication that we were using as well, and that conflict caused a crash in Windows. But I bring that story up because I remember during those few hours of trying to figure out what this kid had done, so much guesswork and superstition went into that process. And if you think about the field of cybersecurity, you think about the field of information security, I think we're in a very critical transition time. We're moving from a time where we worked based on precedent, what folks had done before to do security, the security of a network, the security of a perimeter, to an age where we're actually being able to measure what matters and what doesn't. So that box that you bought 2 years ago that's sitting in the data center, does it actually have an impact on the security posture of the business? And I think the hallmark of an industry, of its maturity, can be measured by how well you can understand the things that impact you. And I mentioned there's this very specific term for this from the field of statistics called degrees of freedom. And I'll just read the definition quickly. Degrees of freedom are the number of independent ways by which a dynamic system can move without violating any constraint imposed on it. So they're the variables in an equation that really don't matter in the final result. Like, you don't care about what color the garbage truck is that comes to your house on a Friday and picks up the trash. The color is a degree of freedom. What you do care about is, does it have a flat tire, for example? Does it not function? And I think that there are a lot of degrees of freedom that we have not yet identified in information security. A lot of other fields have gone through this same transition of superstition to an age of real enlightenment and metrics. I think one of the most pronounced transitions happened in the field of baseball. So 30 years ago, the way you'd select a player for a team was very much based on opinion and superstition. So a small group of folks called scouts would go and they would watch a high school game and look at one of the players and look at them hit and say, wow, I've seen someone hit just like this before. They were incredible. And teams would then make multi-million-dollar bets based on the opinion of a small group of people. I had the opportunity last year to talk to Billy Bean, who was the general manager of the Oakland A's when they went through the transition of moving from using baseball scouts to make those assessments to really relying on data and analytics and metrics. And I'm sure many of you have read the book or seen the movie Moneyball that documents that transition. But it was pretty stark. If you look at how players are selected today, it's incredibly data-driven. There's a lot of information that's gathered every single time a player goes up to bat or every single time a pitcher pitches. And it boils out the impurities of opinion and allows you to actually get down to what matters and what doesn't. Other fields have gone through the same transition too, like insurance, for example. 50 years ago, if you went in and you wanted to get a car insurance policy, they'd ask you a couple of basic questions. How old are you? What kind of car are you driving? So figure out what it's worth. And then have you had any traffic violations in the past? Today, if you go and you sign up for a new insurance policy, new car insurance, the amount of questions that they ask you are incredible. And they ask you very personal questions. So about 2 years ago, my family and I moved from New York to California, and we had to get new car insurance. And I got on the phone with the representative from our insurance company, and they asked those standard questions. You know, how old are you? What kind of car is it? Have you gotten in any accidents? Please explain the speeding ticket. But then they asked a bunch of questions about me and my life and my family. They asked questions like, what's the highest degree of education that you have? Because statistically, actuaries had figured out that people that are more educated in general tend to be less risky. They asked questions like, how many children do you have? Because statistically, again, looking at a large set of data, people that have children tend to be less risky than people that don't. And they actually were able to optimize their business, able to competitively differentiate one insurance company over the other by how well they could assess that individual personal risk. And if I had children or if I had an advanced degree, they could actually lower the price of their product and compete in the marketplace and do it in a very effective way. So insurance was able to optimize their business based on analytics. And if you look at the way that policies are priced today, it's incredibly data-driven. The same move to analytics has happened in almost every aspect of our lives. You know, if you think about how you buy something today, the traditional bookstore you walk into, and those folks typically knew very little about you. You walked in, you browsed, they'd pick the most popular bestsellers from around the country and put them up front, hoping that people would be attracted to them. Today, that same shopping experience online is incredibly personalized. My landing page on Amazon.com is completely different from my wife's landing page. It's been personalized and optimized based on a long tail of statistical data about me. It's really exciting to think about that transition happen in security. I really think that we're right in the middle of it now. And once you go through that transition, you never go back as an industry. Like, you could never imagine the Oakland A's or any baseball team saying, you know what, all this data, all this statistical stuff that we've been doing, throw that stuff out and let's go back and see if we can find those scouts and let them go and look at baseball games again at high school and pick players for us. You never go back once you've made the transition to data-driven decisions. Now, I say that, and there's a lot of possibilities that are opened by that in the security space. But we live in a very interesting age of advanced threats. You can't open a newspaper without seeing some cybersecurity related story. It's incredible. I was reading the Wall Street Journal about a week ago, and just being bored on a plane, counted the number of cybersecurity stories that were just in the first section, and there were 7 of them. It's amazing because it's a time when people well outside of our industry, well outside of the IT industry, are talking about cybersecurity. My mom now knows the difference between a firewall and a wall on fire, and that's a personal litmus test of how much security has entered our consciousness, and a lot of that is because the volume of advanced threats that we've seen, the volume of hacktivist-related activity that we've seen, and the volume of nation-state attacks that we've seen over the past few years. So it's critically important for us to be able to evaluate the risk that is imposed upon us today by this very dynamic environment that I would argue wasn't there a few years ago. If you wound the clock back 5 years ago, the biggest thing that most of us were concerned about were cyber criminals. Today, we have a laundry list of bad actors to think about. Cyber criminals are still on the list. They're more mature than they ever have been, working as a business instead of a lone wolf that we saw in the past. But we've also got people who are very smart, very intelligent, and very capable, who are looking at hacking as a means of expression and as a means of public statements, the hacktivist community. We're also seeing a massive rise on politically motivated hacking. Now, this is a really different environment than any of us have faced in the past. But yet, if you look at how we built our security architectures inside the enterprise, it looks very similar to the architectures you could have pulled out of a textbook 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. Now, even though the environment has changed dynamically, the way that we think about security hasn't changed as quickly. And we enter this very interesting phase where we follow something in statistics that's called an S-curve. Many of us know it as the plateau effect. So it is a measure or mechanism or set of tools that previously were very effective and now are less effective because something has changed in the environment. People know this rule by lots of different names, like diminishing returns, for example. And it affects almost every area of our lives, and it also impacts very heavily cybersecurity. I got fascinated with this concept of diminishing returns a long time ago when I was in grad school, and spent about 2 years researching this topic and published a book called The Plateau Effect with Bob Sullivan from NBC about a year ago. And it's very interesting to see the same diminishing returns we're seeing on some security technologies today happen in very diverse areas of life, areas like physics and the reaction of chemical processes, for example. Part of the reason that we're seeing a diminishing effectiveness of some of the tools that we've relied on is that so much of our lives is now mobile. So we've moved to using mobile applications instead of websites for a lot of the things that really matter to us. So it is incredible the first time you go to a popular website on your mobile phone and a splash screen comes up that says, hey, would you like to download the mobile application? And it's almost itself like a virus because it will continue to hound you every single time you go to that site until you succumb and you download the actual app instead of going to the website. So we've moved into this amplification of the world. That's a pretty significant change in the way that we deal with technology. And we've seen a big change in the way that enterprises are having to manage technology internally. I think there's two big shifts that have occurred. The first one is this push for increased customer intimacy. We want to build a more intimate relationship with our customers, whoever your customer is. Think about the amount of self-service that's happened in so many fields. Online banking is a great example. I can take an app on my mobile phone, log in the middle of the night, and deposit a check by taking a photo of it. That's incredible. If you think about the productivity gain for a person of doing something like that, it's transformative. And the companies, the institutions that were able to release that feature to market first saw significant gain in the marketplace in their own businesses. But yet, you think about that from a security perspective, and you're taking an image and dropping it into the heart of a financial services system. Just on the surface, that's an incredibly scary thing to do unless you have security technologies intermediating and scanning and instituting a layer of protection between that person and the back-end server. But this move to self-service is happening well beyond online banking. If you get into a fender bender accident, for example, most of the large insurance companies now let you download an app, you take a picture of the dent in the car, and you start the claims process immediately. That same transformation is happening in areas like medicine, for example. And over the next few years will completely transform how we interact with the companies that matter to us personally and matter to our families. That's a big change over the last few years. And if you think about the security infrastructure that needs to be in place that allows companies to connect more directly, to take more risk with their users, it's a very different set of technologies. It's a very different mindset than it was in the past. The other big change that's happened is this rise of empowered users, empowered employees. So if you think about 5 years ago, a few employees needed to collaborate on a document, for example. Probably the best tool available in the marketplace to do that was some enterprise server application that you had set up in the business, and it didn't matter if you had to authenticate 3 times and give a blood sample to get into it, you would, because it was the tool that best fit the purpose, and it was the tool that made you the most productive. Today, if you make it painful from a security perspective to log on to the enterprise tool that does something like document collaboration, people just won't do it. There's too many free consumer services that are available that do a terrific job. Google Docs, for example, Dropbox, and people are deciding, not as an entire company, but often as a group of employees around a table to micro-standardize on those consumer technologies. I don't believe as an enterprise we actually have a choice of whether we're going to allow this to happen or not. I think it's going to continue to happen as the pace of innovation in the consumer world continues to grow. So this begs a pretty important question from a security perspective. What is a model that we can create that allows people to go out and use all this awesome technology in a way that actually preserves the bounds around the business that we care about? So to put it another way, how can we allow the maximum degrees of freedom, the maximum amount of free choice variables that employees have while maintaining the constraints that matter. I think there's a couple of disciplines that we can turn to look at how this model would actually work in practice. I'd like to share with you a quick analogy, this is my absolute favorite sport in the Olympics. It's the uneven bars in gymnastics. And if you've never watched the sport, it's absolutely fascinating. Most of the time, you're fixated on the gymnast and the incredible things that she can do. But always in the picture is this person that stands beneath the gymnast, the spotter. And the spotter is very good at being invisible. The spotter protects the gymnast during their routine and does it in a very intimate way. The spotter knows that gymnast well. He's seen her do that routine 1,000 times. He knows when she's about to do something very risky, and you see him coming close at the ready to catch and protect her, just like he is in this photo. But he also knows when she's in a very comfortable part of her routine. And you see him step back and fade into the background. Most people don't notice the spotter because he's so good at blending into the background, but he is the person that gives the gymnast the confidence to do the third release or the second flip. He's the person that gives her the confidence to push the bounds of possibility and potential, because he exists there behind the scenes. And he doesn't just know her history. He knows how she did in practice this morning. Did she get a disturbing phone call from a friend? All of those factors go into how he protects her. The other interesting thing about the gymnast and the spotter is that the spotter does not have veto power. So he cannot go to the gymnast and say, no, you cannot do this second release or this third flip. And that's very much how security is changing today. It feels like our veto power is being taken away. So a couple of years ago, security could make the choice to stop some set of actions, like to stop the move to cloud services, for example. Or we could come in and say that no, something like a Dropbox is too risky for the enterprise, we don't want to allow people to use it, and we had veto power over it. We'd institute a set of policies and security mechanisms to block it. Today, though, what's happening is that the business is going ahead and doing what it needs to do to be competitive in the marketplace. And so I think the way that we protect the business has to change and become very much like the way that the spotter protects the gymnast. I think we need a rich history of data, so we need analytics to be able to do it well. But we also need to be flexible, be able to adapt, and also be able to recover quickly if something bad does happen. And if security is done right in this way, it can truly be transformative. I want to share another image and analogy with you. This one comes from New York City. So this is a picture of Times Square 40 years ago. 40 years ago, Times Square was an incredibly dangerous place. It was a haven of prostitution, drugs, and crime. If you had a young family, you wouldn't even consider taking them into Times Square after dark. It was just an incredibly risky place to be, a place that you should avoid. If you contrast that with the image and the feel of Times Square today, it's an incredible difference. If you look at Times Square today, it's a bustling haven of commerce. Some of the biggest, most trusted brands in the world pay a fortune just to have their names on billboards and be associated with the feeling of Times Square. But what caused this transformation from what Times Square was to what it is today? It was actually behind the scenes a lot of security. Tough policies on crime. If you see something, say something. Prosecution of even petty thefts. Police on every corner. Video cameras. But if you walk around Times Square, you don't see any of that stuff. You're not thinking about that. Instead, you're savoring the experience or trying to avoid somebody trampling over you or running into you. It's incredible to see the contrast between what Times Square was and what Times Square is. And I think this is a great example of what it looks like when security is done correctly. When security exists behind the scenes, much like the spotter does, in a way that doesn't interfere with the experience of the user, that doesn't interfere with the experience of the participant, but instead allows you to operate and achieve great things. One way to think about this is a very life cycle view of what security needs to be. So if you think about the ongoing operations of a business, we're asking the question, how do you set the rules of the road, the policies? Eventually, if you have a sophisticated enough attacker, you get a piece of malware that enters the environment that's never been seen before, that signature-based technologies are not effective against. And so you need to have a mechanism, much in the way that the spotter can catch the gymnast if they fall and then quickly get them back up on the apparatus. You need a way to be able to contain those incidents and then resolve those incidents through analytics. And I think this is a big change that's happened in the industry. We've moved from this idea that we can protect and that we can fully protect, and that's what security is. And if security fails, it fails, and there's something wrong that happens when security fails. Instead, if you look at how most of the other areas of our lives actually work, we anticipate failure to occur, but we have safety nets in place that allow us to recover quickly. And this is very much the transition that's happening in information security today, is we're seeing the rise of safety net technologies, technologies that allow us to do forensics very quickly, figure out what happened, resolve the incident, and most importantly, learn from the incident to make the system stronger. If you go back to our gymnast analogy just for a second, almost always the spotter is also the coach. So they're not only looking at the gymnast's routine to protect her while she's doing the routine, they're also looking at the routine asking, how can we as a team make it better next time? And I think the role of security is very much changing to this one of being able to enable those actions, being able to run actual analytics that matter to figure out how we improve the system and constantly improve the security posture of the enterprise. There are lots of aspirational, I'd say, analogies where security can go to achieve this. One of the ones that's most interesting to me, I spend a lot of time traveling. Last year, I think I flew well over 300,000, probably approaching 400,000 miles. and I spent a lot of time in very questionable cities and countries where I'd never been before, and I'd go to a gas station and buy a bottle of Evian water. And the most important thing to me about that water was when I turned the cap at the top, hearing the click of the safety seal right beneath it. Most of the time, you never think about that safety seal. You just open the bottle of water and drink it. But when you're in those situations where you're concerned about who just gave you that bottle of water, who gave it to them, what was the journey that this thing took from the manufacturer to you, you become very concerned about it, and that safety seal instantly absolves you from a whole bunch of those worries. You don't have to think about those things anymore. And it just exists. It doesn't interfere with your experience of drinking the water or buying it. But there are a lot of risks that existed behind the scenes that you suddenly don't have to think about anymore. And this is very much a model of where I think security is going. It's technologies that enhance the security posture of a business but don't interfere with a user's ability to choose great technology, even from the public space, even from the consumer space. I think that's going to be how we're measured going forward in security, is not in what we've prevented, but in what we've made possible. I want to share one other analogy with you. So when I learned how to drive, the thing that you were tested on, the thing that you actually got a quiz on, and the thing that the driving instructor and examiner would look for is how you hold the wheel. And the right way to hold the wheel when I learned how to drive was to hold it in the 10-2 position. And this is what you were tested on. This is what almost every single driving instruction manual had around the world. It was the statistically calculated optimal way to hold the wheel. It was the way that gave you maximum agility. So if you were driving down the road and a panicked cat ran into the street, for example, you could maneuver around it very easily and very quickly without having to go hand over hand, which is apparently very dangerous in driving. So 20 years ago, this was absolutely the correct answer of how to hold the steering wheel. Today, that position, that 10-2 position, is considered incredibly dangerous. The correct way to hold the steering wheel today is in the 9-3 position. What changed? It was the advent and the popularization of airbags. If you hold the wheel in the 10-2 position, in a low-impact crash, if the airbag deploys, you're going to burn an arm, break an arm, or potentially punch yourself in the face. Today, the right way to hold the steering wheel is in the 9-3 position. But if you go to someone that was told and taught the old way of holding a steering wheel, and you told them, no, that's not right anymore, that here there's a new method of holding it, it's very difficult to get someone out of a previously learned pattern, although something substantial has changed in the ecosystem or in the background. We're in that exact same position in information security. The way that we were taught to do security in the past revolved heavily around establishing a perimeter, establishing enforcement technologies at the perimeter that stopped bad things from happening, and there was a really clear trust model. There were good guys and bad guys. Good guys were people inside of the company, and bad guys were everybody else. Today, that border is incredibly permeable. Today, the business is more mobile than it ever has been in the past, more employees in your company are now getting more productive work doing it from Starbucks or from an airport than they probably do inside of the enterprise perimeter. So the way that we do security has to change dramatically. So if there's one thing to leave you with before we go into the question and answer and the discussion part of this broadcast, is think about the precedents in security that have been set in the past. Think about how long we've made a password, or the way that we've done password reset through biographical questions, the way that we've set up enterprise IT security architecture, and just ask yourself, were those precedents set at a very different time from a threat perspective? Were they set in a very different time from the current threat environment and the current way that your employees are using and consuming technologies? And I think this is a critical time in information security, that those of us that are in it challenge the precedents of the past and look to the set of technologies, the set of practices, the set of even skills that people on the team need to have to deal with a world where we do need to enable freedom of choice, where we need to maximize the degrees of freedom that individual users have, where we can give them the ability to use the best technologies in the marketplace instead of restricting them and thinking about security as locking things down instead of opening things up. So thanks very much for your time. And Stan, I'll turn it back to you to see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Hugh, very much. A fascinating discussion. As I mentioned earlier, this is a live and interactive webcast, and that means we want to hear from people in our audience. So if you do have a question, just please click on the Q&A button on your screen and type the question into the Q&A box, and then press the submit button. We'll do our best to answer the question right now. Hugh, let me start out by asking you, you talked about degrees of freedom. What types of technologies are needed to achieve this freedom?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, I think that some of the most important security technologies today are things that allow you to recover quickly. A lot's talked about in the space of analytics and big data. In fact, those things have become massive buzzwords in our industry. But tools that allow you to quickly identify an incident, to go back and reconstruct what happened with that incident or that piece of malware that's entered the environment, and then resolve it as quickly as possible, getting back to normal business operations. I think those kinds of technologies are critical and underinvested in. Forensics technologies, full record capabilities on the network, for example. So those things are pretty critical. And I'd say also it's not just a technology issue. I think it also is a people issue. I think we need to educate the business to the fact that security isn't this black or white thing. You're not secure or insecure. You're safe or you're hacked. I think security is this continuum now, and there will be incidents that occur. There will be things that get past the perimeter. But we need to have technologies in place that allow us to recover quickly, things like analytics, things like forensics. But great question.
All right. Well, let's move on to the next question. Hugh, you talked about the maturity of baseball and other sports. You mentioned Moneyball, for example. Compared to those things, how far along is the industry in security?
Yeah, no, I think we're very early on in that type of maturity. I think we're very early on in being able to do good risk metrics in security. I think anybody who's been in this industry for a while knows that one of the most challenging and I'd say frustrating things that all of us have faced is we just haven't had good metrics. We haven't had the ability to clearly articulate when we change a security policy or when we add a new practice or when we add a new technology, how much better off are we? And I'd say that right now, though, we're going through this period where we're starting to be able to answer some of those questions. I mentioned that analytics and big data is becoming certainly a very big buzzword, but there's some actual real things that are happening in analytics where we're starting to be able to reconstruct what has happened in an incident and ask, okay, how can we actually learn from this and become better? That's a sign of the beginning of this path towards maturity. So I'd say we're very early on in the process compared to a field like baseball, for example, but we're entering that age of enlightenment now, where we're actually starting to be able to measure things and getting to a period where we're developing metrics that actually matter.
All right. Next question. How would you advise an enterprise to develop a culture of security?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I spent a fair portion of my career thinking about that question, and for years I taught at Columbia University in New York, and it's fascinating when you try and teach people about information security. I think the classic way that enterprises teach employees is to give them a set of rules, right? So tell them, here are a set of things that are incredibly dangerous. You shouldn't do these things. You should be aware there are bad people out there that do bad stuff. In general, I think we need to continue to do that. We need to continue to be able to sensitize people to risks for sure. But I think there is a level of acceptance that we need to come to in security where we know that people will make mistakes. Even people that we've trained 10 times on how to identify a phishing-related email, we need to be able to accept that those people will still make mistakes going down the road and institute a set of security technologies, safety net technologies behind the scenes that helps to silently protect them. I bring it up in that way because many attackers, especially in targeted attacks, are targeting people instead of targeting technology. So if you look at what's behind many of these so-called advanced persistent threats, are the attacker first profiling a company on something like LinkedIn, figuring out who the system administrators are, and then digging down into their lives, figuring out what their favorite sports team is, what their favorite breakfast food is, where they went on vacation last week, and use that personal data to personalize a phishing attack. And in the wake of those types of things, it's becoming harder and harder for a person, even a security-oriented person, a person that has a security mindset, to differentiate between something that's a dangerous link and something that isn't. So I think we need technologies that sit behind that are constantly suspicious and take a look at those links, the data that gets downloaded from those sites. I think we need to double down in a way on those technologies because it's becoming harder and harder to train individuals to make good security choices.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Big data is on the minds of a lot of people, and we do have a question about big data. The question is, does big data have a role to play in security analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're getting to this period now in security where storage has become very cheap, so we could take and capture and record a bunch of data. So we have a long tail of that information, and we can go back and we can mine it for patterns. So it definitely that's definitely a game changer just in our ability to get a long tail of data and being able to go through it. I think big data has a role to play too among companies, right? Today we don't do a terrific job at sharing intelligence among companies, among countries of risks. But other industries have figured this out. Like if you look at, for example, casinos and the gambling industry, even incredibly competitive casinos in Las Vegas have a great means of sharing people that are known card counters, for example. And I think that there's some examples where this has been done well in industry. FSISAC is a great example of an organization that's done it well. But I think big data has a huge role to play in security. I think if we get the algorithms, if we start to get the analytics right, we can actually start to sort out what matters and what doesn't. And that's going to cause a sifting out period in the security space. One of the questions I asked Billy Beane, the guy that was the GM of the Oakland A's, the subject of Moneyball, is, hey, when you started to do this, one of the things that I would imagine is you then exposed a bunch of bad decisions his own team had made in the past, right? If you retrospectively looked at those decisions under the lens of analytics, that there's some decisions that his own team, that other teams have made, and I think that some of that is going to happen in security as well. As we get better at analytics, there's going to be a sorting out period in security technologies where we find out that some are really important and some that we thought were really important may not be as useful as we thought they were. So it's going to be very interesting as that matures.
All right. And finally, our final question in this webcast. Hugh, what is your take on Heartbleed, and how can we avoid similar security bugs in the future?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I spent a good part of my career in the software security space, written quite a few books on it, and it's very easy to make a security mistake when coding. I think we saw that with Heartbleed. I think we see it almost every day if you follow vulnerability announcements from major companies or major open source projects. That one is a very difficult one. I think that one of the things that's been done in industry actually fairly well is software security has become a bigger focal point of what businesses do internally to their own code. So there's been a fair amount of maturity and knowledge sharing around security development life cycles, security development processes. That's happened with commercial code, I'd say in a significant way, some companies faster than others. But it's not happened in the way that you would imagine it would happen in the open source space. So I think that there's a concerted effort that needs to go on in that community to instill security practices. I think many of us who were in software security for a long time subscribe to this notion that if it's open source and you have a lot of eyes looking at it, those eyes will find most of the bugs that matter. That may be true for quality-oriented bugs, but often, even if you're an expert coder and you're not trained in security, you can miss security-related vulnerabilities. So I think that there is a software security component in the open source space that's a procedural thing that I think a lot of companies and individuals can contribute to. But from an enterprise perspective, I think it's also about assessing the types of technology that you have internally and the ability, if there is one of these massive vulnerabilities that affects a lot of components, do you have security technology or enforcement technology at the entryway or at the gateway that can block some of this stuff, or that you can agilely add a policy or change a policy to? So I think that that's going to be very important going forward too.
Well, that is all the time we have in this live interactive webcast. Many thanks to Hugh Thompson for sharing his expertise on advanced threats and how you can protect your data from them. For more information on this topic, please click on the green resource list icon on your screen. And thanks for joining us. For IDG and Blue Coat Systems, I'm Stan Gibson.